My name is Haley. I'm here from ProWritingAid, and my guest today is Caroline Donahue. Caroline has a master's in psychology and expressive arts, and she spent over 15 years studying the creative process and the writing world. She spent a lot of that time asking the question that's on many of our minds. I know it's on my mind. How do you write and finish a book? The finish, I think, for me is very key. I have lots of ideas, not a lot of completed drafts. So Caroline launched the Secret Library podcast 4 years ago so that she could fully explore this question. And on that podcast, she's been interviewing some of the greatest authors out there about how they complete their books. So since she began that journey, Caroline has drafted 5 novels, and she's published an essay collection and a book on beating writer's block. She's also helped dozens of authors write their books, and so we're very thrilled to have her here today to do the same for us. So welcome, Caroline. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here. I just really love doing these web things. It's so exciting to have people all over the place coming together. And especially those of us who write, we're all a little introverted. I'm sure we're the community that was probably the least upset when we were told, you're gonna have to stay home.
Definitely.
I know, I was thinking, okay, stay home with my books, twist my arm,
Yep.
I know a lot of people have had a really horrible time with it, so my heart is really with them. But for me, as someone who's not home with little kids, ours is off at university, and it's been a really good time for writing.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I am really, really excited to have the chance to speak to so many people. It's been a passion of mine to really encourage people to take the risk to write that book that has been haunting you, has been, nagging you, staying with you for years and years. As a writer, a writing coach, and a podcaster, my whole life is about writing and encouraging people to write. So as we're in this crazy time, as we've just said, many of us have been saying for years and years, one day when I have some time or when I can get away from my regular routine, I'm going to write that book. And I guess the world kind of called our bluff, didn't it? So here we are at the do or die moment. And I had this huge vision, actually, as I was going through this period of time. I've been doing, live streaming on Instagram 5 days a week, talking with writers and connecting with them. And I just had this huge wish and vision that maybe if I could put enough content out there and share enough, that there might be 1,000 books out there that people might write that they wouldn't have otherwise had the courage to start working on. And I kind of got the chills earlier when I got an email from Haley who told me, guess how many people are on this webinar? 1,000 people signed up. So I felt, I really had goosebumps. So we've got a lot of work to do, people. So I think we better get started. So our purpose today is to look at going from a dream, you have a dream of writing a book, to a draft, and that you're going to make that transition in 90 days. I first dreamed of writing novels when I was a little kid. I used to drive my mother crazy. I would take stapled stacks of paper and make little booklets. I would draw pretty covers on them, but when it came to writing the book, I kind of panicked. I went to writing camps, I went to writing class, and a little known fact about me, I actually lived across the hall for part of my senior year at college from John Green, AKA, The Fault in Our Stars, John Green, who is a complete sweetheart, actually. But did any of this help me finish a book? No, in fact, it did not. What finally helped me finish the book was back in this, I was digging actually through my old photos today from 2006, 14 years ago. This photo was taken of me hunched behind my computer the very first time I participated in an event called NaNoWriMo. I'm sure many of you know about NaNoWriMo. I think anyone who's at a ProWritingAid seminar knows about National Novel Writing Month, which happens every November, and also in the summer, where you write 1,667 words a day for 30 days, and you end up with 50,000 words. And that was the first time I finished the draft of a novel. And I did it I think I've done it 5 or 6 times now. So I can write a draft of a book in 30 days, but I was dependent on NaNoWriMo. I couldn't do it without NaNoWriMo. And I believed that I had cracked the code, but I was still stuck in this incorrect belief about how writing works and how you get a book done. So we're gonna take the track of do as I say, not as I did, which was, you know, NaNoWriMo is a wonderful thing, but November is not always the time you want to write a book, and you don't always want to crank it out and have no life and do nothing else for 30 days. So do as I say, not as I did. I'm not sure if you can relate, but many of us have gotten the same messages about what's required to finish a book. From an early age, we learn that structure and discipline are what we need to accomplish a big goal. You know, if we have a big dream, we need to work really hard and overcome the fact that humans are naturally lazy and that we are just, you know, we get stuck so easily, we can't be trusted. We have to fight our way through to emerge victorious, snatching the book that we want to write out of the jaws of our Netflix watching selves, right? This is what we believe. And what if I told you that these assumptions are actually what are stopping you from being able to write your book in 3 months, and that you don't have to suffer in order to do it? If you've struggled with writing a book, your problem is not a lack of self-discipline. Your problem is that you've been taught to be a terrible boss for your writing self. It's not about grinding it out. It's not about suffering. It's not about no pain, no gain. You know, that's not how we finish a book. So let's look at what actually helps. I know you all have little digital hands. So I can see, I don't have the chat open, but because I will not be able to focus if I see that. But raise your digital hand if you think you need to be in a location like this. Oh my God, all the hands are going up. Hands, hands, hands. I see little blue hands everywhere. Yes. You know, raise your hand if you think you need to go and hide in a snowy cottage somewhere, probably with a torn sweater, you know, at the shoulder, to go through a movie montage experience where you can finally write your book, you know, along with being a bad boss. So the reason we're a bad boss to our writing self is that we believe that our writing self is lazy and not to be trusted and needs to be watched every moment in order to get that book done. And I don't know about you, but have you ever had a job where your boss watched you like a hawk, was right on you and nitpicked every single action you took and said, are you doing enough? Are you doing enough? I mean, did that inspire you to be creative? Did you feel creative in that situation? I don't think so. I've certainly had jobs like that, and it caused me to shut down, to feel that I wasn't trusted, that I wasn't able to be my best self in that situation. I just couldn't do any work. And that's what happens to your writing self when you think that you've got to grind it out from a place of discipline. The other thing is that we have beliefs running like this, like, I got to go work in this, I got to go work in this cabin. I got to go work in this cabin. And that it can only happen in this situation. I mean, I've tried it. I've gone to the cabin. I used to go to Big Sur a lot when I lived in San Francisco, and I hid away in a cabin, and it was beautiful. But the critic still wasn't happy. That voice in your head that says it has to look different than it looks. The critic is designed never to be happy. And even if you end up in this cabin, even if you've got the torn sweater, even if you've got the prettiest notebook, the prettiest pen, the best looking laptop, all of those things, the critic will keep changing the rules so that you're kept from writing. And the reason for this is the critic doesn't want you to write at all. It's not that you have to get the right circumstances. That's just a lie that it's running so that you're perpetually running around trying to fix the lie, thinking one day I'll be able to write. And the reason for this is that writing is actually a huge threat to our everyday life. And it's a huge threat to our routines and the life we're living right now. We change when we write. Writing is an alchemical process, you know, by transforming our experiences, our ideas, our stories into books. And then by people consuming those stories and reading them, they're transformed further down the line. This is magic, and it changes things for people. I know we've all read books that changed us. That's probably why we wanted to write them in the first place. And so the critic is scared about what's going to happen to you if you start writing a book. And the first thing I'm going to tell you about getting your book done in a shorter period of time, like 90 days, is you have to change the way you relate to fear. When you start to feel scared and have this sense of like maybe a tiger is going to eat you, which the critic is trying very hard to protect you from, this is a good sign. And the reason you're scared is you're onto something. It's not that you're doing something wrong, that you've picked the wrong book, this is the wrong idea. Believe me, I did this 5 times. I wrote 5 different novels and the critic said, oh, no, this one isn't good enough. The next one will be better. You'll have a better idea. It'll all come together. It's not your fault. You worked really hard, but you just need a better idea. That's okay. And the critic was freaking out because I was making progress and I was getting to the end of the book. But we have these beliefs that it's going to be better next time, that we're going to work it out, it's going to look better. So step number 1 to getting your book done in 90 days, when you get scared, celebrate. That means you're onto something. Okay, so other dangerous beliefs we have about writing, which are related, and that is, the kind of life that we have versus the kind of life that we think we should have. This is another one that the critic runs. Okay, oh, I need to have a life that's better suited to writing. And we start coming up with lists of things that will be present. It's dangerous. We think we have to have a different life than the one we have. We may think we have to be a different person than who we are in order to write. And the reason this is dangerous is because it gives us the impression that we're not good enough to write right now. We think we're not smart enough. Maybe we have to get an MFA. We're not prepared enough. We're not ready. Maybe we're not wearing the right outfit. Maybe we need a haircut, especially at the moment. I know my bangs are a little lopsided. I've been trimming them myself for a few months. We may think we need a new computer, new idea, new story, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you have the calling and the urge to write a book, I will tell you, you are ready now. You don't need to have the perfect Instagrammable life. You don't need to have perfect pictures, of your setting where you're working in order to write a book. Writing a book doesn't have to be pretty, and writing a book is rarely pretty. The secret that I will tell you is I want you to picture back before all of this happened, walking into a bookstore and picking up a book that looks really exciting to you. If you're like me, you love the smell of paper in a bookshop. So you're holding this book and you open it and you flip through it and you think, ooh, this looks really good. I read the back, it looks exciting. Did you at any point in time when considering whether or not you wanted to read this book, think to yourself, I bet this author did not write this book in a cabin with snow falling with an artfully torn sweater? Of course not, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how pretty your writing routine looks when you're writing. All that matters is that you finish the book. And the reason that you have this concern about having the correct, beautiful writing routine is because your critic doesn't want you to finish the book. And it doesn't want you to change your life and have your life be transformed by the experience of writing a book. Okay, let's move forward. So here's a real life scene of what writing a book actually looks like. This is not particularly Instagrammable, although I do have little color-coded Post-its. I didn't end up using them, but this is a real image of my chaotic index cards just slammed on my desk as I'm working on my novel and headed into rewriting it. Writing a book is not a romantic movie montage like we have learned from years and years. It's not like Saoirse Ronan in Little Women spreading beautiful handwritten pages all over the floor of an artfully lit attic. Writing a book is a series of learnable and manageable steps, just like any other big task that takes longer than a day or a week to accomplish. Remember those index cards, we're gonna come back to those. But remember, you have undertaken large tasks that you had to break down into smaller steps before. Writing a book is the same kind of task. Okay. So obstacles that you're going to have to deal with in order to get your book written. You're going to have to address your schedule. We've already talked a little bit about addressing the critic. We'll say a little more about that. And you're going to have to learn how to set goals that work for you in order to get the book written. So the first thing for schedule, how much time do you actually have to write? It doesn't matter if it's not very much. One of my favorite quotes about getting tasks done connects to Julia Cameron. I believe it was in The Artist's Way. And for those of you who have a little bit less time, the only difference is that it's going to take a little bit longer. And so there was a story in The Artist's Way where somebody said, do you know how old I'm going to be by the time I learn how to play the cello? Like, why would I start? Why would I take this risk to learn it? And she said, well, you're going to be the same age you are if you don't. So every single person, and now it's getting close to 200 people I've interviewed for the podcast, has told me they wish their book got written faster. But also, pretty much every single one said the time that they took was the time that they needed. So those two things work together. That said, you can definitely get through a first draft in 3 months. So let's look at how we set goals and take this apart so we can break it down for you. Okay, so the first question you have to ask yourself is, how much time do you actually have to write? And when I say actually, I mean actually. Look at your schedule and decide how much time you can sustain when writing. I don't want you to look at like how you can heroically ditch everything you have to do one time, have an 8-hour day and absolutely burn yourself out, feel like crap afterwards and never want to do it again. What we're looking for is a regular amount of time that you can commit to on an ongoing basis. Ideally, that would be 5 days a week. I write Monday through Friday. I take weekends off. Some people love to write weekends and not during the week. It's really up to you. But what we want you to do is look at, okay, how much time can I regularly dedicate to writing and keep coming back to it? If it's 10 minutes, if it's 15 minutes, that's fine. Start there. But mark it out on your calendar as an appointment. Now, I want to say a word to the people who have difficulty sustaining these appointments for their writing because they believe, oh, this thing is just for me. Everything else that I have to do, it's for somebody else. I have to do something for my family. I have to do something for my kids. I have to do something for my job. But writing is just something I do for myself. So if you are this kind of writer and you have difficulty setting this time aside, I just want to share a thought, which is think about a book that absolutely changed your life. You read it and you said, oh, I'm not going to be the same afterwards. There's a book I read every year. It's a novel, and the author, it's called Enchanted April, and it's written about a group of women who are at a really difficult place in their lives, overcoming that difficulty. And the author wrote it at a terrible time in her life. She was going through a bad divorce, and she wrote this book, because she just needed to engage with a happy story. So it would have been really easy for her to say, oh, this book is just for me. I don't need to take this time. You know what? I should really focus on other things. This is ridiculous. I've got a lot going on. It would be really easy for her to set that time aside and not write the book. And she read this book about 100 years ago. But when I think about if she had just said, this isn't important, it's just for me, I'm going to set it aside, how I would miss out on this book that has given me so much inspiration and hope. I want you to think about a potential reader who feels that way about your book. And every time you think this is just for me, it's not just for you. Even if it's for one other reader, it's for them too. And when you can't come to those 10 minutes a day and you let something else in your life take that away from you, you're taking it away from them too. So think of this as an appointment with your future reader. And think about in your schedule, how much time can I give my writing on a regular basis? Okay, so managing the critic. Now, we've talked a little bit about why it's upset. You know, it's trying to control you and it's trying to protect you. The critic is the part of your brain, it's the lizard brain, which we didn't call it the lizard brain in psychology, but I think that's how we all think about it now. And it wants to protect you from leaving the cave and getting eaten by a bear or being put in danger. So it's upset because writing a book is going to upset the status quo of your life. And it's worried that you're not going to be safe. So you want to assuage the critic, and you also want to start treating yourself like the nice boss. So we talked earlier about the overbearing boss who's micromanaging and trying to control everything so that it feels safe. This is the critic trying to help you. So you want to start talking to yourself the way you wish that mean and overbearing boss talked to you. Give it a little more space, let it breathe, trust it. And you can start thinking about your critic as a character. My critic is a man named Ebenezer. He's a hoarder. He lives in a studio apartment and he drives a really old car. And every time I start to do well in my writing or anything starts to go well in my life, Ebenezer freaks out and thinks he's going to be forced to leave his studio apartment. And I have to tell him, Ebenezer, I am never going to make you move out of the studio apartment. If you want to live in the studio apartment and hoard newspaper clippings forever, you are okay to do that. So if you start to listen to the voice that tells you, don't write this, it's a bad idea, or this is a huge risk, no, you should really do something else, don't write that book. Listen to that. Is it a young voice? Is it an old voice? Does it sound familiar? Are there qualities? What does this person look like? How old are they? What do they do for a living? What are their hobbies? Start to develop a character like you would in a book around your critic so that you can relate to them. And then even better, give your critic a job. And the very, very best job you can give your critic is to keep track of your writing sessions. Your critic loves details. And something that I do is I keep a process journal, which was at the recommendation of one of my teachers. So I write down what time I write, how I felt about it, what I covered. Depending on what I'm working on, I'll write down the word count and what time of day it was and everything. I use a 5-year, one of those undated 5-year journals. Leuchtturm makes one called Some Lines a Day, and it has a small space, so you don't feel like you have to fill a huge amount of space. And you can give the critic the job of keep really good track of how our writing sessions are going, and that will give your critic something to do. You can also remind it, we will revise later, and I will let you run that process, but it's not your turn yet. Okay, so goals. Now, when we're setting writing goals, and if we're going to get from the beginning to the end of a novel in a period of time that's defined like 90 days, it seems like we want to set a really, really big goal at the beginning and go really hard and use up our energy. But that's actually not what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to look at the time that we've set aside that feels possible, our appointment with our future reader and with our writing. And we want to start thinking about what would be both manageable and meaningful to accomplish in that amount of time. If we've got 15 or 20 minutes a day for the first week, we'll say, okay, what could I reasonably do in 15 or 20 minutes? Could I write a couple of paragraphs? Could I write 1 page? Could I write 2 sentences? You want to have this balance between it's manageable, I could do this even on kind of a crappy day, but it will add up over time in that it will end up being meaningful. So you're only going to set goals for a week at a time. Writing is a lot like physical exercise. I know this is going to sound crazy, but stay with me. A very well-known author you will probably have heard of, Haruki Murakami, is a long distance runner in addition to being a novelist. And he has written a book, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, which I really love. I am also a runner, probably because I am such a terrible athlete that I was picked last for every single sport that was out there. My entire family, brilliant athletes. I was like the kind of, what happened to you? I think it was I was much happier reading than exercising. I can handle running because I can do it by myself, and all I have to do is run in a straight line. But writing is very much like exercise. If you try to say, start lifting weights, and you go into the gym and you pick up the biggest weight in the whole gym, and then you strain and strain and strain and try to pick it up, are you going to end up okay? No, you're going to, throw your back out and end up not getting to exercise at all for 6 weeks. And you're going to be back on the couch watching Netflix. So we want to think about writing as actually something that requires stamina just as much as exercise. So we're going to start with the amount of time that we have that we've pulled out from the calendar. And we're going to look at what would be meaningful to accomplish in that time. And we're going to do it for 1 week. Make it small enough that you have a feeling of success associated with each writing session. And if that is writing 2 sentences, then make your session writing 2 sentences. You got to trust me on this one. I know everyone's saying, oh, that's crazy. I can't write a whole book if I only write 2 sentences a day. That's nuts. But what we want you to feel is a sense of success and accomplishment each time you sit down to write. So you make the goal small enough that you feel like, yeah, and you can cross off your goal every time you write. It does not matter how small it is in the first week. You get to the end of that week, and then your critic gets to come back in and say, how did that go? Could I do a little more next week? How does that feel? And then you dial it up a little bit. If anyone has ever tried a running program called Couch to 5K, you will recognize this approach. I actually just finished it today. I ran 5-6 years ago. I was a pretty avid runner until I met my husband, and then realized I didn't really feel like getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to run anymore. And I would rather hang around and have breakfast. But I've come back to running during this period of time, and I too felt like, I'm going to walk for 10 minutes. That's just silly. But now, after this period of time, I've gotten back to the point where I can zone out and run, and I feel much more in control of it. Now, I could have started at a really big increment back where I was when I did before, if I had this big, kind of macho approach, but that wouldn't have helped me. I could have gotten injured, and it could have thrown off the ability. So making your writing goals small at the beginning, and then repeating and assessing on a weekly basis and dialing them up a little bit is going to keep you feeling successful. This is about staying with your drive to write, and the part of you that wants to go out hot and try to write 2,000 words on your first session, that's the critic trying to sabotage you. Because when you can't do it, it's going to say, see, I told you this was a bad idea. That's not your ambition that's driving you to go big. It's your critic that's sabotaging you and wants you to fail. Now, to further go with my running analogy and to connect with Haruki Murakami, to keep on going, you have to keep up the rhythm. This is the important thing for long-term projects. Once you set the pace, the rest will follow. So by starting this way, starting small, you're able to build stamina over time, and then you can maintain it. What feels really hard in the first week is going to feel like nothing by even the 3rd or 4th. So you're going to dial up your effort over the course of writing your book. Okay, so now that we know a little bit of the philosophy, we're going to return to those index cards that I talked about earlier. Once you have your idea for your book, I could go on, actually I did go on. I did a free webinar earlier this week, which Haley is going to share a link. I made a page for you so you can watch that, because a lot of people come up with the, what if my idea isn't good enough fear when they're starting to write. So I did a whole hour class on how to make sure your idea is ready to start a novel, and she will be sharing that link at the end of the class, so you can watch that after the fact. So I'm just going to assume that everybody has an idea they're happy with from this point going forward. You're going to want to get some index cards. I am a huge fan of index cards because they are concrete and manageable. And what you're going to do once you have your idea for your book is you're going to write the major moments that will take place throughout your story on index cards. If you have Scrivener, which I'm sure many of you do, and you prefer to work digitally, you can also use the index card view in Scrivener and make your index cards that way. In my writing community, that, my people who take my classes and my clients, we have sort of team digital people and team analog. I kind of go back and forth between both, but you're going to start with your index cards and you're going to think, okay, what are the crucial moments in this story? And then you're going to write a moment on each one of your index cards. And I want to say a little bit about outlining. So, you know, some of us are plotters and we really like to have all of our detail organized in advance. And some of us are pantsers or discovery writers and prefer to leave it much more open. So I recommend getting the size of the index card to correspond with what type of outliner you are. If you like a really loose outline, you can get little tiny itty bitty index cards. They're usually used for language learning or flashcards. So look for those, and you're just going to put, you know, a phrase on yours. You know, she meets the guy in the restaurant, whatever level of detail you want to have. If you're more of an outliner, you're a plotter, you really like a lot of detail, get the big index cards so that you can have more detail included on your cards. And then keep writing cards. Write cards for every major scene you can think of. Now you may have larger gaps between them, again, if you're more of a pantser, but if you're a plotter, you can write one for every single major scene that you can think of. And that's going to be your first process. I would use your writing time that you've set aside for at least, you know, the first 3-4 days, maybe even the first full week, just to make index cards and get really clear on what's going on in your story. Then you're going to use your writing routine time to start working through those cards. Again, if I convince you of one thing in this presentation, it's that 15 minutes spent writing is valuable. It's okay if you have small blocks of time. It's also okay if you take small blocks of time throughout the day. It doesn't have to be all at once. You don't have to be, you know, Stephen King. I adore Stephen King's book on writing, but I do find that some of his routines are really difficult to match. I do not write 8 hours a day, even under the best circumstances. I write 2 hours a day, like I teach people to do. That's about my amount of time that I do. And it hasn't really slowed me down, to be honest. So once you have the index cards available, you're not starting with a dead blank page. You're going to take out one of your cards. You're going to set your timer for the amount of time. Now, by this point, you've probably moved on to week 2, assessed, okay, how much time do I want to take with my book for this week? Set your timer and then write for that amount of time. You know, set your goal in week 1, follow your goal, assess how it went, see how it feels. See if you feel like, wow, I feel like doing a little bit more. Now, don't listen if the critic is saying, you should be able to do twice as much as that. You're not a real writer, forget it. Just don't let the critic judge whether or not you're doing a good job. If you said, I'm gonna write 2 paragraphs and I'm gonna write for 20 minutes or 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and you can check that off every time, then you deserve to celebrate that. And you deserve to feel really good about that accomplishment. That's success. Feel good about it and then move forward. Now, another note about the writing routine and whatever amount of time you set aside, it is not necessary to write the index cards you have written for your scenes in order. You may not be the kind of writer who wants to start at the first scene and go all the way to the end. Some people I know and have interviewed like to start at the end and work their way backwards, kind of like the movie Memento. I know Diana Gabaldon, who wrote Outlander, writes one scene. I call her method the Granny Square method. She came on the podcast to talk about it. She one scene, she gets really in depth with that scene, and then she works and works and works on it, and then she sets it aside, and she doesn't know what the next scene is going to be. She goes on to another complete scene, having no idea what the order is going to be at the end of the book. So you do not have to work in order, and I really don't think with her show being a very successful TV, or her book being a successful show, that it's really hurting her all that much. Even before it was a show, those books were huge sellers. So you don't have to start with index card number 1 and go all the way through to index card number 25 in order. What you can do at the end of each week is assess again, how do I feel about the time I spent this week? Do I want to spend a little more? And as you see yourself work through these index cards and find your way through from start to finish, you will start to feel a sense of momentum building. The hardest part is at the beginning when you have the least amount of belief in your ability to do this. So as you move forward, it will get easier and easier, and you don't need to spend 8 hours a day doing it. Whenever I have tried to write more than a couple of hours a day, I do burn out, and my words and my writing stop flowing. Okay, a couple of tips on if you get stuck. Don't look back and start refining the pages from before. In fact, it's a really good idea not to look back at all. Again, if you're using Scrivener, I would just open a new document each time you start a writing session. Don't look at the previous one. Don't let the critic get fired up and say, well, let's see how this went. Let's see. And don't worry about things like, oh no, I think I've changed this character's name. I'm not sure. You know, find and replace can fix that in 2 minutes in a revision. So just keep going forward. If you change a character's name, that's fine. You can fix it. It's easier to just go forward. If you're not using Scrivener, I would still have a folder for your writing and create a new document in whatever program you're using and just number them in whatever order you're writing, even if you're writing out of order, so that you don't have the problem of having to look back. I would not write in one long document in Word because that will trip you up and you'll have to scroll through what you've written already, and that is a dangerous game. It's better to just keep going forward. Sarah Selecki, who's a wonderful writing teacher and has been on the podcast like 4 times because I love talking to her, she talks about this being kinder to your writing. It's kinder to your writing to just keep going forward. Another tip if you get stuck along the way is that you want to add more conflict. If you are stuck and it feels like the book is getting flat, a lot of the time it'll happen in the middle of like the second act. You'll feel like this blah feeling. Then the question you want to ask is, what is the worst thing that could happen in this situation? What is my character's worst nightmare? What would be the absolute worst thing that could happen right now? And try to get that into the book. A lot of us have protective author syndrome. I know I do. I really care about my characters and I want to protect them from having any kind of bad circumstances. And a lot of us like to avoid conflict. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. We want to avoid conflict in our everyday lives, but fiction is actually the opposite. The more conflict you have, the easier it is to write. An example I gave in the lecture the other day is, would you rather write about Jane has a nice day, or Jane woke up, her bathroom had flooded, she's running late to give a presentation that's going to determine whether or not she gets a promotion, and she really needs this promotion because her mother is sick and she needs to pay for her medical care. I mean, which scene would be easier to write about, right? So if you get stuck, make sure that there is more conflict coming in. The other thing to remember is that many people worry about how much they should be reading while they're writing. And for me, my belief is that the more you're writing, the more you want to be reading. So make sure you set time aside to read while you're writing. It's a little bit like having gas in the car. If I try to write a whole lot and I'm not reading so much, then it's a little bit trying to drive, like trying to drive without gas in the tank, and I will stall out. There's a process of inhaling and exhaling. The creative inhale is when you read, you watch films, you take in stuff that feels really juicy and inspiring, and you want to really increase that because writing is an exhale. You're putting words out, you're explaining, you're describing, you're putting life experiences out on the page. And if you don't balance your inhale and your exhale, that's another way you're going to get stuck. Okay. The final thing to remember is that this is not the last draft. This is the first draft. And the purpose of a first draft is to answer the question, what happened? What happened in this story? And you're going to figure that out as you're writing it. But at the end of the draft, it's not going to be finished. A lot of us have this interesting equal and opposite fear as writers. And I find that these fears are of equal intensity and equal stress and equal presence. One of which is that no one is ever going to read our book, that we're never going to finish it, that it doesn't matter, that nobody cares. There's going to be nothing at the end of the day. That's on one end. And the other equal and opposite fear is that this creature that I call the evil publishing elf is going to sneak into our house before we're ready, steal our manuscript and share it with everybody and put it in Times Square and publish it in the New York Times everywhere so that everybody will see it before we're ready. This is also not going to happen. You know, the book is not going to be released before you're ready. You get to say. So will your book be perfect at the end of 90 days? No, but it will be recognizable as a story. My editor and my teacher has compared writing a book, as many people have, to building a house. So what your goal is at the end of these 90 days is to have a structure that's recognizable. Like when people first build a house, you want to have a recognizable structure that looks like a house. But is it going to have electricity in it? No. Do you know what color the walls are going to be? Are all the pretty windows going to be in? You know, have you furnished it? Of course not. That's not the point of a first draft. The first draft is to build something that's the structure and the overall outline of a book. Revising is shaping and firing the clay of your story. You're making it into what it ultimately becomes. But in the first draft, you're inventing the clay out of nothing. It's really hard work, but all it takes is you coming back again and again and looking at your index cards, setting a timer, and spending some more time in appointments with your books. So my question for you at this point is, you know, are you ready to start? I think you are. But I'm sure you have more questions, so I'll bring it back to Haley to see if you have questions that I can help you with.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you guys have questions for Caroline, feel free to drop them using the Q&A function. That helps us keep track of them. The chat moves rather quickly, as we all know. So thank you so much, Caroline. That was so helpful. I really loved the idea of naming your inner critic. I definitely have a very specific inner critic who is very much the perfectionist, who's like, you have to have the softly muted classical music playing with the torn sweater. And if that's not your vibe, then you can't write, Haley. So I'm going to talk to that person tomorrow.
It's a lie, man. It's a lie.
Yep.
This person is just afraid of what's going to happen when you start writing, which is probably going to be something awesome.
Yeah. And I also love the suggestion to set reasonable amounts of time. For me, I'm always like, I will write 5 hours today on top of my full-time job. And there's no way. And so if I can start doing it in smaller chunks, 15, 20 minutes, then I can start making progress without just sitting there and feeling like I'm doing nothing because I don't have 5 good mental hours. So anyway, enough about me. Let's dive into some of the questions. Okay, so first off, we have a question about the don't look back until you reach the end. So Jonathan says, the advice, don't look back until you reach the end. Is that the end of the novel or the end of the material related to the index card? Some people advise to read your previous day's work so you can easily get started on the current day's writing. What's best?
I personally don't look back until I finish the draft. I realize that's going to sound a little crazy and be a little controversial. I know there are those people out there who have the advice of rereading what you've written the day before in order to write. I think that that's probably works really well for people who are established professional writers and write really regularly. But the issue is if you're just starting out, I think that we're all really vulnerable and we're very easily swayed into thinking, oh God, this isn't any good, I should give up. And rather than even start thinking that way, the necessary thing is just to move forward, and you can refresh your mind of what you wrote the day before with the index card so that you still have a clue as to what you've done the day before. You're not going in blind, but you're not going in and turning on your editor hat and starting to evaluate the quality of your work. Because the trick is, once you have an entire draft written, it's harder to disregard it and give up. But if you've only done a couple of scenes, it's a lot easier early on to say, oh, this might not be any good. I should just forget it. So I would advise just plowing forward through the draft. You may feel differently in revision drafts and want to go back, but in a rough draft, I would just go straight through.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of relates to this question from Stacy, which is talking. So Stacy said, I'm almost finished with my first draft, but the fear of failure is stopping me right before the starting line. And Stacy's afraid that it's not a good enough story and says, help, what should I do?
Well, I think the thing to remember is that the only thing you have to accomplish in that first draft is figuring out the bare bones of what happened. I think pretty much everybody I've interviewed, including my favorite example being V.E. Schwab, who is a unicorn in that she has only ever worked as a professional novelist. She's never had another job because she was able to start that way. And I bring this up because even someone where that is the case, she has reported that every time she writes a book, she gets to the point where she writes to her editor and says, this is shit. I need to hit delete on the entire draft and chuck it. You know, even a person who has only ever written books for a living has this feeling. So you are not alone in feeling that way. And the problem is that we never get to read people's first drafts. We only ever read finished drafts in bookstores and in libraries. And so we're comparing our first draft to somebody else's finished draft, which might have had 20 drafts, gone through an editor, gone through an editing team, gone through a proofreader. So it's really not a fair comparison. And you will be able to assess and change structure. I've had huge changes happen in my rewrite. And I think we can't expect a polished, finished manuscript out of a rough draft. So I would say keep going, don't worry, and you will know more than you think about how to fix it when you go back through in a revision.
Yeah, I love that idea of just getting all of the major beats and connecting them and getting the bones of the story there and not worrying that it has to be publish ready from the day you type the end, that there will be many points in between there and then. Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Lauren asks, how much background work do you do before writing the scenes on index cards? I feel like I need to flesh out my character bibles, premise, themes, etc., but that will take some time and a lot of research before I jump into the scenes. Can these things be done simultaneously?
Yes. I think essentially the person I defer to on research is Paul Schering. Interestingly, he wrote a novel, but people will probably know him better. He was the screenwriter for Prison Break, a TV show, and he's written a lot of screenplays, but he wrote a novel that was set partly in the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of research to it. And his theory is that he does research until he feels clear about what he needs to do next to write. And then he writes until he runs out of space and then does the research to continue. So I would say I would do just enough of the character development in order to feel clear about, okay, what are the events happening in here? There's going to be more character development that you do, and you're going to get to know your characters better as you write the first draft. So I do my quick and dirty cheat sheet for doing character work is there is a website called 16 Personalities. It is an Enneagram, or no, it's not Enneagram, sorry. It's Myers-Briggs.
Yep.
It's Myers-Briggs, and I will take that quiz as my character quickly. They have a really thorough overview, and I will just go through and instinctively, very fast without thinking, answer questions as my character, and then read what I get and then use that as a character Bible. I don't take the time to kind of invent that whole process, because you could spend 6 months on that alone. And I have done that, but I realize now that I don't have to do that anymore. So that would be my recommendation if you feel like you're stagnating and spending too much time on character development. The couple of resources I would say are 16 personalities. You can also go through and answer like the Proust questionnaire as your character, and that will give you a ton of information to work with without feeling like you have to kind of invent the wheel for your characters over long periods of time.
Yeah, I love that because that helps you understand motivation and just kind of how they would react in all of the different scenarios that you'll be tossing them into in your work. Okay, so Amy says, tips for getting into your writing process faster. I find I sit down and it takes me a long time to begin any real writing of my scenes. This is hard when I only have maybe 15 or 30 minutes to write.
Yes, I would say having some kind of ritual associated with your writing practice. It's a little bit like, I mean, I have 3 cats and a dog, which is kind of nuts, but we have trained them to have certain kinds of routines so that they know what to expect. So you kind of have to train your writing self with things like, okay, I'm going to sit down. I had a particular playlist that I played whenever I was writing, and that was helpful. I know the writer Eden Lepucki, who wrote California and Woman Number 17, who is a friend and lived in LA. She had a plastic ring that she bought, I think at Forever 21. And she said, this is my writing ring. And she put it on and said, now I will write when I have my writing ring on. So you can start to associate these things. But the other thing is having a sort of transitional experience. And a teacher of mine, Scott O'Connor, who's a lovely writer, but he likes to sit and read a couple of poems before starting to write, because he doesn't write poetry, he writes fiction, but it helps him transition into language and this thinking about language that helps. Another exercise I've found really helpful that Sarah Selecki uses in her writing course, which I've taught for, is to pick a letter randomly out of the alphabet, set a timer for 1 minute, and write as many words as you can think of that start with that letter. And it's a way to get your mind into the writing mode. I would do it in a notebook rather than typing, but you just write by hand, you know, pick a letter like L, and then I did a whole page, and I would often do this at the beginning of writing sessions during the first draft of my novel. And it just helped me shift away from everyday brain mode into generative language mode in a way that was non-threatening and not scary. So if you set a timer for a minute, that's only going to take a minute of your writing time, and hopefully that will help.
Yeah, it's just kind of start switching how you're thinking and how you're using words. Great. A number of people have asked about kind of word counts in relation to writing time. So some people have asked for you, for your 2 hours, how much do you usually write? You know, should you aim for a specific word count within that time, or should you just kind of aim to write for the entire time?
I would say I would see for the first week or so that you're doing, see what you're able to write, and then aim to look at what you're doing and then increasing it incrementally. So I think everybody has a different experience. So I think my word count in particular is not necessarily going to be reflective. I mean, I know people who write way more than I do or way less. It doesn't really matter. But what I think is if you find out what you naturally write in the amount of time that you have and get a sense of what your rhythm is, and then say, okay, if I write X number of words in this amount of time, if I increase this time this much, can I write this little bit more? And knowing that kind of math and that formula is a way that you can then start to extrapolate, okay, if I can write 500 words in an hour, then if I write for an hour and a half, I can write 700 maybe. And then that's about how long it will take me to get to X point in my draft. But I don't think it's particularly helpful to compare yourself to anyone else, because even from one writer writing different projects, I might have a different writing. I have a hugely different word count in revision than I do, which is what I'm doing right now, versus when I'm initially drafting. Drafting is way slower. Revision, I'm often sometimes just re-putting in stuff I've already written and modifying it slightly. Obviously, that's faster. So I think it's just looking at what you can do in that time and increasing it slightly and then building it up over time.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to another question that a number of people have asked, which is like, what does the equivalent of this process look like in the editing and revising stage?
Yep. That's a whole other...
Yeah, I know. It's a whole other webinar. Yes.
Yeah, I have a whole process that I do for revising. Of course, index cards are involved, but what I do, to give you the quick and dirty version, is I take time away first from the book. Absolutely. Like, I mean, I think you can take less time away right now because time is so weird right at the moment.
Yes.
I think probably 2 weeks is the equivalent of like a month and a half. But if you take time away and do something else, that's the first thing. So it feels separate from you. You don't want to have this feeling like you're still hooked into the project. Then I read it through once as a reader, just to see how it feels. Do I want to keep reading the pages? How does it feel to me? Mm-hmm. Then I read it a second time and I start writing down questions like, okay, where did this come from? What happened? Those kinds of things. And then I'll go through and do a spreadsheet. I'll list each scene, then make sure there's at least 3 reasons that the scene is present. And that could be, we learned something new about the character, it moves the plot forward. I always say there's needs to be critical components to the scenes. And then I have the question, is it working? Yes or no? In the column of the spreadsheets. I have a lot of sortas from my recent novel draft. And then you make notes about well, what does it need? And a lot of people worry that they're not going to know, but you've read thousands of books at this point in your life. I know you have. You knew whether the book was working for you or not. You have more ability, and this is part of why you take time away, is because so it feels like someone else's book and not yours. So you say, okay, is this working or not? And then once you've mapped out your whole book that way, you'll be aware what scenes are missing, what needs to be filled in, and then you work through your whole draft doing that process.
We'll have to have you back for a full outline of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So apologies to everyone who has a question that I haven't answered. Please feel free to send it in to hello@ProWritingAid.com, and we will try to respond to all of them that we haven't gotten to. Quickly before we end, a couple of people have asked if this process will work for memoirs or nonfiction as well as novels.
I think it absolutely will, because particularly for memoirs, because memoir has critical moments that you're following. You have scenes. Memoir functions very much like a novel, in that you're telling a story. You decide when the beginning is, when the end is. All of those details are still present. In addition to that, for nonfiction, it may not be scenes, but it may be topics. So you can use your index cards for topics you want to cover, sections, subjects, ideas, and then you can start filling them in that way. So I think it works brilliantly. I mean, that's how I wrote my nonfiction book, was exactly that way. I had topics instead of scenes, and then, I had my points I wanted to cover, and then wrote them in my sessions, and it worked just fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Caroline. This has been amazing. So much information for me to take away and work on my own drafts, and just checking out the chat. Sounds like all of our attendees have felt the same. Awesome. So to everyone, I am dropping now in the chat a link to our newsletter, to our upcoming trainings, and as well as Caroline's resources. So a number of you have asked about her podcast. Caroline, I'll get you to repeat the name of that in just a second. But she's also put together a training that you can watch for free. So please feel free to check that out. And if you had any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, please feel free to send them to hello@ProWritingAid.com, and we will get to those. And I'm just going to drop it one more time in the chat for everyone. Also, we will send the replay out of this tomorrow, so you'll get a chance to check it out. Caroline, thank you so much again. Tell us where we can find you, your podcast, and all of that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I have 2 websites. My website is CarolineDonahue.com. And that's where I have all of my teaching and coaching work that I do. And then the podcast is the Secret Library Podcast, and you can find it at secretlibrarypodcast.com. It's on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, you name it. It's on pretty much every platform that you can find. If you search for it in your podcasting service, you should find it. We just finished, also for the people asking about revision, we just finished season 2, which was entirely about revision. So we talked to a huge number of writers. There are 15 episodes where we're talking about revision. So those of you who want to dive into that part of the process, there's a lot there. But we've had, I think, close to 200 episodes now in the past 4 years. So there should be something. On the resources page I curated a list of episodes that are particularly useful to people working on fiction. So you can click through from the resource page to find those.
Awesome. And for everyone watching, we will send those links out to you as well as drop them in our replay page so you can check them out. Caroline, thank you again so much. Everyone else, thank you for attending, and we will hopefully see you again soon here at ProWritingAid. Bye, everyone.